Hello and welcome. When I hear someone say, I want to learn to weave, I now start to ask them three questions. What do you want to weave? How big a space do you have? And what is your budget? Now, why do I ask those questions? Because there's so many different kinds of looms, there's so many different kinds of woven projects out there, it's a good idea to define what it is that you would like to weave before we actually start talking. Sometimes I hear all sorts of responses that people are trying to be helpful. It is nice to be helpful, but sometimes what I'm picturing in my mind and what you are when you want to weave are totally different. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through several different kinds of looms. Now, I don't have all of them. I only have a few. And talk about the looms and also talk a little bit about what you could make with the loom. And talk a little bit about the area you might need, extra tools, and your budget. So we're going to start now with taking a look at a few looms that maybe might be interesting to you and learn a little bit more about how they work, what you can make, and we'll start with the smaller looms, the most, I guess you call it the least expensive looms, and then we'll work our way up to some larger, more complicated looms. All right, we're going to start with cardboard. Most of us have some kind of cardboard around the house, and this one is a very small cardboard loom, and if you can tell, it's made from a cereal box. Now what we did with this one is that we cut notches in the top, and then what we did, this is an example of one that was done, we wrapped some string all the way around it, let's turn it this way, and then we wove back and forth using a darning needle. And what did we make? We made a little pouch. In this one, a little button, you can put things inside. You could also just weave on one side if you want to, back and forth. Now there are small looms out there that you could purchase and do things like this. There's some pin looms, there's some they call tiny looms, all kinds of things. But this is one way to get yourself started. Or perhaps you could get a piece of cardboard like this and you can weave this. Now if you take a look at this, this one was woven on this and you're saying, wait a minute, this is a lot smaller. One of the things that many people forget when they're weaving on cardboard or whatever, once you take it off, it's going to shrink. Now, this was woven about, maybe an inch and a half wider. It also shrunk in the other direction. So you have shrinkage this direction as well as the width. So keep that in mind, whatever project you do. Now, some of these ideas came from a book. I am not sponsoring the book, this particular book, and hopefully I'll write that in the description at the beginning of this. And you can do all sorts of fun things, circular things, you could do different wall hangings, all kinds of things on that. There's also another book called Little Looms. Now some of the looms that I do not have, but you can look up, and I'll put the names out there, are INKLE looms where people weave with bands, make bands, and they also have backstrap looms. A backstrap loom is, you put it around your back, you tie it onto another part, and you make some string heddles. Another easy way just to get started when maybe just low budget or you're not sure if I really want to weave or not. Now, what can you do with some of the smaller projects? You can take some of those small pieces if you have them, and you can sew them together to make larger things. That's one idea if you have a space issue and you only have some small pieces. Just think about different ways you can put things together. Now, here's another loom that you can look up directions on how to do. It's called a peg loom. Now, in this situation, I'm using some yarn that's hand spun, and what I'm going to do is I'm literally weaving it back and forth, and I've seen people also use fabric strips, and what the idea is that you can also use what we call some top or roving, and you're weaving it back and forth like that. And then what happens is you push this down, you eventually pull the pegs out, and the yarn starts to slide down the cord that you have there. And again, you can look this up on the internet and you'll find more, but that's what a peg loom is. That might be something that you could use to make pillows, maybe some rugs, different things like that. If you try to do some scarves, it would be very thick, but it's a possibility to do something like that. So that is an example of a peg loom. This is an example of a tapestry loom. It's a small one. I actually purchased that to do some bead weaving on it years ago. It's kind of fancy compared to a lot of them. Many tapestry looms, you could just have a piece of wood frame with nails at the top, nails at the bottom, and wrap it back and forth. You can also get little small wooden looms and again a pin loom. This one's again a little bit fancier. It has all sorts of moving parts on it if you want to use them all. Now what can you do on a tapestry loom? Well, on a small loom like this. Now this is obviously bigger, it was woven on another loom, but you could do something like this, just maybe thinking of it smaller. To me, this is kind of a nice tapestry piece that you could weave, and when you're doing something like that, sometimes you need something to beat the yarn or to make, and you don't have a beater. Now, of course, you can get something fancy like this, but you could also use a comb. Again, if you had the cardboard or if you had something with nails on it, you could use something like this to just to spread your warp down. Now you can also do what I showed before, the rigid heddle loom. You could use this manipulative stitches on here if you want to, and adding beads and things. So I'm just putting different things on here so you can see you can use some of these looms for other purposes. You don't have to just do one thing on them. Of course, a tapestry loom, I have a friend who has a huge one that's vertical. You could also do tapestry on a floor loom. If you wanted to, I'm sure you could do band weaving on here as well. So there's more versatility to one loom. Again, this is a kind of a fancy loom, tapestry loom. There's a lot of others out there. It's just something that if you want to do a little sampling, you can try it out and do that. But again, when I think of tapestry, probably what I think about is something like this, where you don't see if you notice here is what we call the warp, the white part. It's not white here, it's blue, but you cannot see any of the yarn that goes in the vertical direction because it's all covered up with the yarn. Again, when someone says tapestry weaving, that's what I picture. Perhaps you picture something else. Now this is an example of what we call a tape loom. It's a very early version of a rigid heddle loom. And in this one, what you do is, this is stationary, and what you do is you would basically lift up, take your shuttle through, lift down, and bring it back. And then what you would do is you would use this shuttle to beat it, not the rigid heddle. Like I said, here's a rigid heddle, the modern version, and the modern version, a lot of times we use this as the beater. In this case, this is kind of a historical piece, a reproduction, to make narrow tape, so it was used maybe to decorate things or to tie cords and things together in the past. And here we have an example of a rigid heddle loom. This one is, I believe, 18 inches wide weaving width. They come narrower, they come wider, and they also come with different reeds. Now when you get a rigid heddle, sometimes it comes with one reed. This one is what we call, I believe, 10 dents per inch or 10 threads for every inch. So if you're doing different projects, you might want different size reeds depending on what you are making. Now this one happens to fold up. They come in all sizes, like I said, all sizes and price ranges. Now what can you make on a rigid heddle loom? Well, if you are a hand spinner or you just have some wool, you could make a scarf. This one's hand spun yarn. And then this one was woven on here. What else could you make? Well, maybe some placemats. You could also do some placemats on here. And in addition, there's a lot of fun little manipulative stitches that you can also make using crochet hooks and darning needles and some other things, and pickup sticks. In addition, I've also used my rigid heddle loom and did some bands, narrow bands. Now instead of using the heddle to beat back and forth is what you normally do, what I did was I used a smaller heddle like I showed you on another one, and then what we did was we used that to do the beading. Now this is a larger one, but I pulled it all in and did bands on there. You can do a lot of other projects on a rigid heddle loom as well. And some people get 2 rigid heddles, then they can do more complicated weaving. You're just using your hands to go up and down. It's a little slower process, but once you get some experience with it, you can make a lot of fun things. And again, it doesn't take up much space. This one has a stand. You don't need a stand. You could also put on the table. This one folds in half and goes in a little carry case. So it depends on what you're looking for. Again, an example of a rigid heddle loom, another loom that you might be interested in trying.